Beautiful. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you are having a fantabulous Tuesday. We are here today to talk about the Autism Professional Learning and Universal Supports Project, which is a newer grant that is funded through the Illinois State Board of Education. And we will give you an overview of our history, where we came from, so that you have a better understanding of our targeted audience and who we are and what we do, the services that we provide, those that are available to every district within our state, and then some more intensified services based on need, and then we'll have a time for FAQs. So I'm throwing up on the screen the quiet room. So back in November of 2019, the Chicago Trib partnered with ProPublica. Are all of you aware of these series of articles? So this highlighted, it was a collaboration between these two organizations, and it highlighted the wrongful and inappropriate use of timeout and restraint in our state. And so the first article was released back in November of 2019, and it was the first of about 7 or 8 articles that have been released as a part of this series over the past couple of years. And so it highlighted different school districts, special ed co-ops, as well as non-public and private entities who have high rates of timeout and restraint, or if there were complaints to the state. Chicago Trib and ProPublica highlighted what was happening in many of these classrooms where students with autism were being restrained for long periods of time, or put in timeout rooms for up to 3 or 4 hours a day by themselves. And so I happened to be at a conference, and as many of you are aware, when you go to conferences, you get refueled and really excited. So when this article was released to my colleagues and I, it was like an aha. We need to put support back in the place where teachers need it most. So how can we get classroom level support so that teachers and paraprofessionals who are working with students with autism who have significant big behavior needs are able to access support? So previous to the 2019 articles, we at ISU had a different grant. The Illinois Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project was funded through the Illinois State Board of Education from early 2000s until 2013. And we went into classrooms that were that had students with autism who are at risk of losing their home placement, their school placement, or their community placement. And we developed in classroom support, provided technical assistance, in classroom coaching for paraprofessionals so that they would be able to be better equipped to support students who had these big behaviors. And so to us, when we saw the articles released and the schools that were identified in many of them, those were all schools that our old Autism Project used to provide support to. So we knew how effective our previous project's support was. So we reached back out to the Illinois State Board of Education and said, hey, we have a solution to this problem. And we were asked to write a proposal and highlight what that technical assistance and professional learning would look like and how we could provide support to teachers who were working with students who had these big intensive behaviors and high support needs. So we were asked to write a proposal, and from that, the Autism Professional Learning and Universal Supports Project was funded. And there's a QR code there that will get you to our website. I'll also put it into the chat, but it is autismplusil.org. And we were funded to do, we were funded through the Illinois State Board of Education to provide support to those entities that had first been identified in the Quiet Room series. And so we would go into classrooms and really focus in on changing teacher practice, One of the other things that came out of these articles was the development of the student care department at ISBE. And so the student care department was developed, and at that same time, many of you might remember the state did a recall for timeout and restraint data. At the time, back in the 2017, 2018, 2019, these timeout and restraint forms that were collected were mainly kept locally, and they were not shared back with the State Board of Education. So at that time, the state did a recall and asked for all of those data pieces to be submitted to ISBE. And they took that information and they have disaggregated the restraint and timeout data that was shared. And so this is just the previous 4 or 5 years worth of data that kind of highlights how frequently timeout and restraint is used in our state. So if you take a look at that 2018-19 data, we know that that might not probably be as accurate as it could be because the state had not mandated any system for collecting timeout and restraint data. It was all local process. So the 2018-2019 data at that time was all emailed into ISBE, and they collected that information and disaggregated it. So if you take a look at this data, put in the chat what surprises you. So we have the number of incidences. So that is any restraint and timeout. And you can see we have in this most recent year, they have not been able to do the data pull to identify the timeout minutes or the average minutes per timeout. But if you look at those, there's some that are pretty lengthy, and that's the average. So a 29-minute timeout compared to, we're seeing a decrease in last school year, 22 minutes of a duration of a timeout. These are the number of restraints. So in the current school year, and this is data that was pulled as of April 27th. So just a couple of weeks ago, there were 31,300 restraints used in our state. And then for any of you that are familiar with the Form 1101, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Anytime a restraint or timeout is used, there has to be imminent danger. And so that would be danger to self, danger to staff or students. And you can mark on the form all 3 of those. And so that's why those numbers might be very elevated, because there might be a danger to the student, the staff, and others, or others in the environment. So that's why those numbers are so inflated. If you take a look at danger to self, though, and this is a concern that we also target, is when we're entering data that shows that there was no danger identified. So restraint and timeout should only be used when there's imminent danger, and imminent danger needs to be defined. So imminent danger by the state is defined as a serious danger to self or harm that results in a safety concern. And so one of the things that we take a look at also is, why are we using restraint and timeout when there was no danger identified? So this is data. We were with our friends at ISBE this past week, and this 38,929 number has already been escalated to over 40,000, I think 41,000. Just in the past 2 weeks. So there are high rates of timeout and restraint that are continuing to be used. And so our project was funded to provide support to schools, special ed co-ops, non-public and private. And when we talk about non-public and private, if they have autism as their primary disability category that they provide service to, then our project could go in and provide support. So our districts are identified through this data that is entered into SIS. So anytime there is a timeout and restraint, it is entered into SIS, and that data is disaggregated. And then anytime there is the long durations of timeout or high frequency use of timeout, and the same with restraint, then that entity would get passed on for our coaching support and to collaborate with our project. And I'll talk about what the different support looks like in just a moment. So this is some of the data that has been shared. This breaks that RTO data down by grade level. So we see high rates of restraint and timeout in those early elementary years. And then surprisingly, we see high rates again for the 12th grade and above. So that those transition programs, 12th grade, 18 years old to 22, we see an increase in those numbers. And then if we break it down by disability category, we see that this the disability category that students receive services under, autism, is that disability category that is the highest number of events of RTO. So this is last year's data. So when we take a look at students with autism, there's over 13,000 students within that eligibility criteria that have had a timeout or restraint used with them. And then that single student might have multiple events. So just a couple of weeks ago, there was an increase in our prevalence rate. So April is Autism Awareness Month, and right before the beginning of April, the CDC released that there's an increase from 1 in 44 to now 1 in 36 students. So it's not going to be, it is very uncommon to not have a child with autism in your classroom or multiple students with autism in your school. And so what we do is we come in and we provide support to help teachers have access to evidence-based practices at that universal tier 1, so that we can hopefully provide support so that we can change student outcomes. When we take a look at the number of students who are receiving services under that eligibility criteria of autism, we have seen a steady trend over the last 15 to 20 years. And this is interesting to me. If you take a look at the 2020 to 2021 school year, 2019 to 2020, 2020 to 21, when COVID hit, we were not qualifying students to receive services. And I feel like that's probably why we're seeing such an increase during that 2022-2023 school year, because now that we're back in session and supports are back in place, students are now qualifying for services. And so I would tend to say, if we had not been hit by the pandemic, we would continue to see that same big increase, but it would be a prettier trend line than taking out these 2 years that the pandemic hit. So this means that we have a lot of students in our school system that are receiving services for autism, and this does not capture anyone or everyone. We know that there's many students who are receiving services for OHI or SLP for speech and language. And so this probably does not capture all of our students in the school system who have autism, but it does capture those who receive that eligibility of autism spectrum disorder. We also know that we're not just pulling from some of those other disability categories, because we would start to see those numbers go down and decrease as we're labeling students or qualifying students. And that's not the case. Those are either maintaining or increasing as autism continues to increase. And so we are truly seeing an increase in our school system, which aligns really well with this data right here of 1 in 36, that we're starting to see even more students diagnosed with that, with autism, as well as receiving services in the school system for autism. So our project was funded in March of 2020. So we were asked to submit the proposal. And so some of the things that we do is we really want to take a look at how can we promote positive, proactive approaches so that teachers have the tools to support all students who are going to be entering their classroom with autism. And so we provide technical assistance based on that RTO data and provide intensive coaching to those identified districts. But we have lots of other resources and supports that would be available to any school district or school in our state. And so those are some of the resources and supports that we're going to highlight and talk to you about today. Our goal is truly to build capacity. We want to make sure that we are providing evidence-based practices and teaching teachers how to use those evidence-based practices so that they can feel more comfortable in supporting their learners who have autism. And then a long-term goal is we truly want to increase the percentage of students with autism who are educated in the general education classroom. We know that post-school outcomes indicate that the best services are if we can provide that support in the student's home school and have them gain access to gen ed curriculum with their same age peers. So if we can really provide those supports in the student's home school with evidence-based practices, we're going to set that student up to be more successful. So our goal truly is to increase all schools' capacity to serve students with autism. And when we say students with autism, we also want to make sure that we're capturing students who have intense behavior needs, as well as those who have related social and communication challenges, because oftentimes the supports that we're going to put in place for a student with autism is going to benefit many of our learners who have higher support needs. And so that's really the focus of our grant and our project. We do a lot of different things. So through our grant, we have lots of different ways that we provide professional learning. One of those is online modules. So if you hopped over to our website or linked to it from the chat, you'll see there's a whole tab that highlights online learning. So we have developed a series of modules that focus on autism. We have Understanding Autism, which is about an hour in length, and it is our #1 accessed module by paraprofessionals. And so we think that is absolutely wonderful because oftentimes, as you're aware, our paraprofessionals are the individuals who receive the least amount of training. However, they are supporting students who have the highest level of need. And there's not that many autism trainings available on the internet that are high quality. And so we've developed modules that specifically target students with autism. I'm gonna pop ahead and then come back. These are an example of many of the modules that we have available. So the Understanding Autism, we have evidence-based practices. So when you're supporting students with autism, there is a whole body of research that identifies about 36 different evidence-based practices that have been shown to work really well for students with autism. So we have evidence-based practices, visual schedules, functional communication training. So we teach the participants how to develop functional communication supports in an attempt to decrease behavior, because when we talk about behavior, we say behavior is communication, and we need to teach a replacement functional communication so that the student would use that formal means of communication instead of using their behavior. So we walk through that process. We have an overview of functional behavior assessment, ABCs of behavior, so understanding the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequences that support behavior to help understand why a behavior continues to happen. We have another evidence-based practice, which is planning for personal independence, and how can we create our learners to be independent. And then the last one that we have up there right now is prompting strategies. So prompting, as we're teaching students to use and learn new skills, oftentimes we'll have different types of prompts. And so we have a whole module that teaches how to effectively prompt students with autism. All of the modules are about an hour in length, and were developed based on adult learning strategies or theories. And so we know that the attention span, because of some of our social media usage, has now created our attention spans to be short. And so all of our modules are developed to mirror that. So there are about 5 to 7 minute chunks of information, but multiple chunks so that an individual could start and stop it whenever they are able to. And so that online component is one of the ways that anyone can access more information about autism. We also have a virtual community of practice. So anytime an individual has completed one of the online modules, we offer an opportunity to become a part of a virtual community of practice. In that virtual community of practice, there are online resources. So each month we open it up to a new topic, and we provide resources that target that topic. So some examples include visual schedules. So we have lots of different examples of visual schedules. So we have examples of how you would create a object schedule for some of our more concrete students, or students who would benefit from high levels of support. And then we have examples of different photo schedules, icon schedules, written schedules, and all of these are available through that community of practice. We also have some of these resources on our website. And our goal is, we know these visuals and a lot of these support take a lot of time to develop, and we want to take that away for teachers so that they don't have to spend the time developing. Instead, we have access to resources that are downloadable so that staff can print and go, or download it and manipulate it so that it meets the needs of their students, and hopefully allows for easier implementation so that it doesn't require the time that it takes to create visual supports. We also, as a part of that virtual community of practice, host monthly office hours. And so this is connected to that virtual community of practice. So if there is a topic of visual schedules, like my example, then we would host virtual office hours that targets visual schedules. And then after we have engaged in that dialogue, then we would open it up to any participant to problem solve. We like saying that we're thought partners, and we allow teachers to come on and just without violating confidentiality, share some of the issues that might be having, and then we can just give some recommendations or ideas to consider to help them better support the learners that are in their classroom. And so those are some of the virtual options that we have available. If any of you were familiar with IATAP, the Illinois Autism and Training and Technical Assistance Project, one of the big projects that project did was an experiential training. And so it was a hands-on week-long training. And that's another component of this project. That is probably one of the best hands-on trainings in person that has been rolled out throughout our state for supporting students with autism. And so during this week, we have 5 students with autism, varying support levels, come in, and we have coaches working one-on-one with those students and modeling best practice. So teachers come and they get about an hour's worth of information. So the first day is focusing on characteristics of autism. The second day focuses on communication and putting communication systems in place. The third day focuses on positive behavior supports and all of those proactive antecedent-based strategies that we can put in place, highlighting the use of visual supports so that we can be effective using those supports. Thursday highlights social interaction, and then Friday is evidence-based practices and inclusion into gen ed curriculum. And so each day teachers get a little bit of information, and then they spend about 4 or 5 hours in classrooms working one-on-one with the students with autism. And so it's kind of a fade and release model where it's intensive at first, where the coaches are working more with the students. And then each day that school team, the teachers that are at the training, get more hands-on experience working with the students with autism. And then after that experiential training, we enroll them in that virtual community of practice so that they can have access to additional resources and problem solving throughout that school year. So that's another option for in-person training. Here's that flyer that highlights the online training. Another thing about the any of our trainings, each training, the online ones are about an hour, but all of them you will receive CPDU credit if you're seeking CPDUs, as well as a certificate of completion. And so that is another support that you can share with your staff. If they're looking for CPDU credits, they have that, but also then they can download that certificate of completion to show that they have completed some of the online modules. This is a direct link to our virtual community of practice. This is a just a quick handout that highlights what the focus of our virtual community of practice is. So the virtual community of practice is really targeting staff who are working with autistic learners. So we want them to be able to share information. So as I mentioned, we share resources, but we also want teachers to be able to come along and say, hey, this was a support that I developed for this student, and they can upload it into the social story folder so that they could then share that with another teacher who it might be a resource for. So we want to create this little network or community of practice so that people can tap into other supports that they have created, share resources, and also have an area where people can problem solve and really have a thought partner so that they can talk through some of the behaviors or ways that they're supporting students. So we wanted this area to really have a shared purpose, just to really focus in on and support our learners with autism. This is another handout, and I will email, and you can have access to all of these resources that really highlights our virtual office hours. They're the first Monday of the month. We're not doing them in June, July, or August, since most schools are out of session or different summer school programs. So they will start up again in September, but it will have a topical area, and then we'll highlight a little bit of information and resources related to that topical area. For instance, some of the areas that we've identified are behavior and behavior supports, self-regulation, de-escalation, evidence-based practices. So those are just some of the areas that we target, and then we open it up so anybody can have a conversation about how they can better support students. We also offer some outside professional learning opportunities. So if your district wants to target autism supports for a school improvement day, or you want to train some of your paraprofessionals or some of your program staff, we will come in and do training. And so these are just some examples of some of the training that we have done. Beginning in August, we typically hit setting up classrooms or using independent work systems. We'll also highlight de-escalation strategies and some of those behavior supports that we can put in place so that a student has a functional way to communicate instead of using their behavior. And we like having those supports in place at the beginning of the school year so that we can start off successful. So these are just some examples. We used using independent work systems to build independence in students. And then we worked with an ROE, and we offered a virtual series of training. And so we highlighted some of the same content that is in our online modules, but when we deliver it in a webinar, we are very interactive and engaging, and want to target the needs of the schools that we're working with. So these are just some examples, and you can reach out to us to be able to provide some of that online training for your staff specific to autism. And I think that's another important thing is we are the only K through 12 funded project that targets autism or supports for autism. And so we want to make sure that we're sharing the best information that we can. So through our grant, we have different types of support. As I mentioned, the coaching really comes in from that RTO data. So we work very closely with student care to identify districts or schools that have high rates of timeout and restraint. And we come in and really want to provide that coaching support. I don't know if you've ever seen the slide that talks about professional learning, and when you're just sharing information, there's very limited implementation, but when you increase the level of support and follow-up or coaching support, then it bumps it up to about 95% implementation. And so we rely heavily on that relationship we have with the teachers in the classroom and provide that coaching support. And so that's what that looks like. When a district is identified as having high rates of timeout and restraint, we will work with a district to really focus in on developing a behavior change team. And with that team, it's almost like a train the trainer model where we'll come in and really target that team so that they have the support to then go back and share more resources within the different buildings of a school district. We use the APERS, which is the Autism Programmatic Environmental Scale, and I have a slide on it in just a second, but we use that as an environmental assessment that allows us to identify what schools are doing really well. So what are their areas of strength? Do they have good collaboration with grade level teams? Do they have good teaming processes in place? Do they have great curriculum and IEPs? So it highlights what schools are doing really well. And then it also highlights what would be areas that we target for professional learning. And based off of that data and what the school is recognizing as areas in which they could grow, we work together and develop a virtual coaching plan or an in-person coaching plan. And sometimes it's a hybrid of both. And then we provide professional learning and coach out those targeted areas over time. Systems change takes 3 to 5 years. So we like forming relationships and become very close with many of our districts. We travel the state. Yesterday, we were way down south. The end of last week, we were way up north. So we travel all across the state to provide support. The APERS is a tool that is going to be available through Brooks Publishing. During COVID, our first year of funding, we collaborated with the University of North Carolina, who houses this project, the APERS project, and they came in and they provided training so that we could be trained implementers of the APERS. So the APERS, you can see on the screen, highlights 10 different domains: teaming, learning environment, positive classroom climate, assessment and IEP, curriculum and instruction, communication, social competence, personal independence, functional behavior, and family participation. And so these are research-based different domains that then we know positively impact program quality. And when there's different structures or indicators in place, then we can increase the likelihood that we can push out evidence-based practices that target some of these areas, which then in turn increases learner outcomes. And so these are the areas that the APERS focuses on, and we come in and we do this assessment. It's a lengthy assessment. We first start out by doing a review of records, and we take a look at IEPs and how IEPs are written. And then we take a look at if the supports and resources that are identified in the IEP are implemented throughout the learning environment, within the classroom, in the hallways, and all of the different areas that the student might interact. We do a heavy observation. So we stay in and follow students around for 3 to 4 hours in the day. And then there's a strong focus on interviews. So we interview, if it's in a gen ed classroom, we'll interview the gen ed teacher. We'll interview the paraprofessional or teaching assistant that might be supporting that student, a related service professional. So that might be a speech language pathologist or a school psychologist if they're providing support, or a social worker. We interview the parent, we interview an administrator. So we get lots of different input. And then we take the data that we reviewed from the records review, the data that we collected from the observation based on the APERS scale, and the interview data, and we analyze it, and that's the output that identifies what the school strengths are, and then what would be those targeted areas for improvement. And that's how our action plan is then developed from. And so we'll work with schools from a year to multiple years. Some of the schools that we first started working with back in during the pandemic in 2020, we're still supporting now. On our website, we also have lots and lots of resources. So we have a series of fact sheets, which are handouts, which highlight different evidence-based practices or areas that are related to autism. So for instance, we have a fact sheet on medical diagnosis versus educational eligibility. Very different things, but sometimes often confused for teachers in the classroom as well as for parents. And so we have lots of different resources. Does my child have autism? Sensory regulation, visual supports. And so these are front to back, short, easy to implement strategies or bits of information that can be downloaded from our website. And these are just a sample of them. There are many that are available. We also, underneath the resources area, have lots of different downloadable visual supports that would be available so that anybody could go in and download them and manipulate. So we'll have PowerPoint files or Word files so that teachers can come in and download it and then edit it so that it meets the needs of the students that they're working with. So these are some examples of behavior supports. We also have supports for like zones of regulation and teaching self-regulation skills. We have lots of these examples that are tweaked for different support needs. So we might have a visual that has more pictures for students who require additional support. And then we have also some of the same strategies in a written format so that you get that, that continuum of support. We also have lots and lots of different visual schedules that can be downloaded, and then you can use photos that you take with your cameras when staff are developing schedules. They can snap some photos, or if your district uses some type of icon library, visual icon library, you can import those pictures. So there's lots of different resources that are available in that resources tab that are available for download. And that really highlights our project. What questions do you have? We are located in Bloomington Normal on Illinois State University's campus. Are there any Redbirds as participants today?
Yeah, feel free to type into the chat. You can type it to everyone so we can all see your questions and comments. And if you'd like to share anything on the microphone, just simply raise your hand using the tool in the bottom toolbar, and I will be able to allow you to unmute your microphone. But we got plenty of time for questions or comments if you type them into the chat. Thank you.
I can go back to our professional learning that's available online. Like I said, these are all about an hour-ish to complete. They're built to be very foundational. So they're great for staff that don't have a whole lot of prior knowledge. So they're really good for your school improvement days, or if you have staff that need targeted training in these different areas. There is also the passing of Public Act 102-0339, which requires any teacher who has used timeout or restraint to have targeted training on trauma-informed practices, crisis de-escalation, restorative practices, identifying signs of distress, as well as the legislation calls it behavior management. We call it proactive approaches to supporting behavior. So many of the targeted areas of our online training does meet that Public Act 102-0339 requirement, so that teachers can print that certificate of completion and show that they've met that requirement underneath that training umbrella. Yes, you can reach out to us. You can also batch upload. So if you want teachers to take the training, you can email us an Excel spreadsheet and we can upload everyone into the system. We can also, if you email us, let you know if any of your staff have completed the training. Our system also allows us, if you do a batch upload, it will allow us to send a report weekly so you can see who has completed what, how much progress have they made, who finished the content, where are they at within working within the modules. So it allows us to generate some data that hopefully is helpful. And we have lots of teachers that hop on for the virtual community of practice just to access the resources and have somebody to talk to. That networking component, I think, is something that since COVID hit, we haven't been able to be in person. And so we've been very creative in how we've used some of our virtual opportunities for connection. And so that's allowed us to create these online networks so that teachers have a place to come and connect with others. What other questions do you have? For that virtual community of practice, our August is going to be hitting some of those like foundation practices that we really want to see in place when students begin the new school year. So it's going to target, again, those visual schedules. It's going to target some behavior supports. It's going to highlight communication and making sure that we're identifying communication systems that match the learner's needs so that we can teach a student a formal means of communication that is easier and more efficient than using their behavior. So we're going to really hit some of those foundation supports that we want to see in place that have big bang for their buck so that we can put those strategies in place and students can be supported well as they begin a new school year. And a lot of those strategies are going to be effective right now because we have such a different schedule right now with sometimes there's field trips that aren't typical field trips. Or the air conditioner's kicking on and the heater was on just a week ago. So the sensory system is a little discombobulated. So a lot of these supports that we're highlighting and that are available are really important right now, just because there's so many changes going on within the environment.
Wonderful. Nikki, I want to thank you so much for sharing all these amazing resources, all these professional learning opportunities that you all have developed with Autism Plus. Really appreciated you sharing all of that with us this afternoon. Oh, another question came in. I'll let you answer.
Yeah,
John.
sure. Can you share your thoughts or theories regarding what factors are driving up the numbers of students diagnosed with autism? So we know that we're seeing a true increase. We are better at diagnosing. There's no doubt about that. We have some really good gold standard screening tools as well as evaluation tools so that more students are being diagnosed. The ADOS, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, is that gold standard diagnostic tool that is used to identify if students are on the autism spectrum. What do I think is going on? I went to a conference a couple of years ago, and it was the keynote speaker. His name was Edwin Trevathan, and he was on the DSM-5 board that was reviewing and changing the criteria. So back in May of 2013 is when the new DSM was released. And so previous to that, there was autism spectrum disorder as an umbrella, and it included 5 different disability categories. So it included autism, it included Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett syndrome, as well as childhood disintegrative disorder, not otherwise, childhood disintegrative disorder. And then there was PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So that meant a student would meet the criteria of some of these other disability, not fully meet them, but they still had many of the same characteristics. Therefore, they would receive that PDD diagnosis. So in 2013, what happened is they kind of condensed the way that we might diagnose. So instead of those 5 different disability categories, it was combined into one, autism spectrum disorder. And so anyone that had a previous autism diagnosis would receive services underneath that autism spectrum disorder. But now as we diagnose based on levels of support. So an individual could receive an autism spectrum diagnosis, 1, requiring minimal support, 2, requiring some support, or 3, requiring substantial support. So that changed how we diagnose students. However, we're also seeing a true increase. So the keynote speaker was talking about how did we diagnose spina bifida? And he went on to say that spina bifida was cured because, not cured, but the rates of spina bifida were reduced because we infused the American diet with folic acid. So any women of childbearing age would take folic acid, and he began they began doing more research on the impact of epigenetics or on environmental factors that impact our DNA. And so over time, what they learned is there's other environmental factors. So one being the food that we put in our mouth that might substantially change our DNA. And he related it to McDonald's popping up on different corners. And so the fast food nation hit in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And as a result of that, we had this obesity, high rates of obesity in the United States. And so he was saying, could it be lots of different environmental factors that cross the blood-brain barrier? So some of the toxic chemicals that we use for cleaning, the pesticides that are put on our food, on all of the farmland and different crops. Could it be all of these different interactions of the environment over time is changing the human genome, making an individual more susceptible to autism? So we know that there is a strong genetic link. And so oftentimes when a student or when a child is born, they may show signs of like extreme colickiness, and they may have that genetic autism where you can see it passed down through family members, generation through generation. But then there's this other type where a child is typically developing until 18 months, 24 months, and then there's a rapid regression of skill. And so he was relating it to maybe that developmental pathway is related more to that environmental factor, so that we do know that there is a genetic factor as well as this environmental impact that might make a child more susceptible to autism. So if there is a genetic history or predisposition, and we have all of these different environmental impacts, that could flip a switch and be one of the causes of autism. So we know that there is no cure, but we do know that there are lots of educational supports that we can put in place. What else is very interesting is the beginning of early intervention was back in the early 2000s. And so we oftentimes provided services, intensive services when children were young, and now we're seeing drastic outcomes. So for our young adults right now who are diagnosed in the late 1980s, 1990s, who are now young adults, they might have been more impacted when they were young and received high levels of support. But now we're seeing them entering college because they might have received lots of services when they were young. So we know there's multiple reasons that a student may have autism, or a child may be diagnosed with autism, that genetic link, or there's an environmental impact. But we do know that intensive services that we can provide can increase outcomes for students. And then I see there's one more question. Is there a video parents can watch that would support them? All of our modules are parent friendly. We wanted to make sure that the information that we were providing is understandable by all people, so parents can access any of our online trainings. And then there's lots of fact sheets on the website that are developed specific to parents, so that they can gain information. Any other questions?
All right, looks like we've got all the questions addressed. Any final comments, you can type them in there. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video recording.